evening. We're welcoming Anne Vileisis. If those of you who were fortunate enough to join us a couple of days ago at the Discovery Center, Anne was there signing her book and talking to people that dropped in, and we had a really great turnout. It was really fun to do an in-person event of that kind back at the Discovery Center after all this time. So if you were there, hopefully you got the book. Hopefully you've started reading it or finished it already. I'm just going to turn it over to Anne. Let her introduce herself, or excuse me, tell a little bit about herself and about the book and a little bit about the history of it. And just want to thank you all for being here and remind you that we do these talks free of charge. We would love it if you would go on our website and make a small donation, which helps us with the resources that go into organizing these talks. And I want to especially thank Wendy Felsen, who's here, who's responsible for working with our guest presenters and organizing them.
Thank you so much, Trey. And it's good to see, I don't get to see everybody's faces, but I know some of you like Wendy and Peggy, some of you that I met last week are there. And it's really nice to see you, those of you I can see, and others that I've met last week. It was really great to be at Noyo Center and see the beautiful displays you have and to learn about your vision for sharing information and natural history about the amazing marine environment you have in Northern California with your community and more people. So I was really excited to be there and meet many people in your community. And I'm excited to be here tonight now to tell you a little bit more about my book. A book is an extraordinary creation in that it takes a long time and a lot of research. It took me about 10 years to write my book. A slideshow is a different kind of creation because it has images that can be shared. And so tonight you get a chance to see what I've put together with the slides. And for some of you who may be reading the book, this is like another version, a different one. So I'd like to start by telling you a bit about how I started on the path of writing a book about abalone. I happened to be exploring a cove in Big Sur down on the Central Coast, and I found a shell. It was actually this shell. It was a beautiful little iridescent shell. I was walking on the beach, and it was the first time in my life I'd found an abalone shell, and its iridescence was literally stunning to me. It was just so beautiful that I was literally inspired. I just had to know more about this animal that could make such a stunning shell. Also, I'm an environmental historian. I research and write books about people's relationship with the natural world through time. And because I'm particularly interested in how food fits into that frame with some of my previous books, I was somewhat aware of abalone as an amazing wild food. I realize people in this crowd, some people may know a lot about abalone and others may be kind of newbies, but as many of you probably know, abalone is an animal that's been a big part of California culture, identity, and cuisine, kind of like a lobster in Maine or a salmon in the Pacific Northwest. For a time, as I'll explain, abalone was extremely abundant in California, but then declined sharply. And now we have 2 species on the endangered species list. And all of the other species are considered either species of concern or are imperiled. So when I first started to ask around and learn why, I found that people of a certain age who'd spent time on the coast had fond memories of foraging, diving for, and eating abalone. These were vital, hallowed, formative experiences that meant the world to people. There also were nostalgic experiences that often ended in a poignant feeling of loss that abalone's past prevalence was so diminished. And so there was anger and blame too, directed towards overfishing sea otters or government mismanagement. And these were certainly factors, but as I dug deeper, I realized that there was a big mismatch between these personally experienced memories and what a longer, more ecologically grounded historical perspective revealed. Not only did the mismatch make people feel really bad, it also revealed to me that having the wrong story or just part of the story is what contributed to how our abalone have ended up becoming so imperiled. And so I realized there was a rich history to discover, chronicle, and share, um, because the story of what happened to abalone is really important for us all to know because it's a part of our West Coast heritage, but it's also quite revealing, important to understand, and relevant to the challenges we face today in conserving marine life into the future. So I'd like to take you on this evening on a whirlwind tour through some of this epic history that I learned. So let's begin with the basics. Abalone are marine snails. There are 7 species in California and on the West Coast. There are 8 here, but a couple have been clumped together. These beautiful photos were taken by Buzz Owen. Here, let's see, who started as a commercial diver back in the late 1950s and became a serious self-taught abalone taxonomist. Here he is with a big red abalone shell. Red abalone are the largest species in the world, and this shell is particularly giant. You could literally serve a salad in it. And this is the kind that you guys have predominantly up where you live. I'm having a little bit of trouble advancing my slide. There we go. Okay. So abalones range along the whole West Coast, but especially in California. There's a cluster of species that generally favor cooler northern waters and a cluster that favor warmer southern waters. They also have their own niches of depth, also related to water temperature. So some northern species live in the south, in pockets of colder, deeper waters. Most all abalone are subtidal. They live in deeper water. And here's a live red abalone. The holes in the shell are respiratory pores, which are used by the animal for breathing and also for expelling wastes and for broadcasting gametes out into the sea for reproduction. Abalone primarily eat kelp. They sit and they wait for torn off bits and pieces to float by, which they reach out to lasso with their tentacles. One species, the black abalone, is intertidal, and it is adapted to put up with dramatic changes between the ebb and flow of tides. Just mentioned these guys were up in your area, are very rare now. And when I was there at the Noyo Center, we were looking at shells, and I think you have one sample of a black abalone shell in your case that you can look for. So starting at the very beginning, the longest phase of abalone history is before people showed up. The oldest abalone fossils found on the West Coast are nearly 70 million years old. And I went to find them at the LA County Museum, and there they are. They were just like tiny pebbles in an itty bitty test tube. Through millions of years of evolution, abalone developed a big, powerful foot to grip tightly to rocks and a strong shell to clamp down around their bodies as shelter. Both that foot and shell help to protect them in a sea of hungry predators. But both of these attributes would later become compelling as a delicious meat and as a brilliant and beautiful material when humans showed up. So most archaeologists now think that people first came to North America along the coast, following a kelp forest highway. Some of the earliest evidence for human habitation on the West Coast is the remains of an abalone dinner eaten at the end of the Pleistocene, a single shell dating back 13,000 years. Based on archaeologists' work examining the record of shells at the Channel Islands, we know that shellfish were important to the subsistence of growing human populations for millennia. About 6,000 years ago, beautiful shell artifacts started to become more common in the archaeological record, revealing that abalone were increasingly used for cultural purposes, tools, ornaments, and ceremonies, and were traded throughout native communities in California, the desert Southwest, and the Great Basin. Here are some beautiful abalone creations made by indigenous people living around the San Francisco Bay, collected by British and Russian expeditions around 1800. And this photo of a hoopa dancer from more than 100 years later shows abalone used in ceremonial regalia, representing a profound spiritual use of the shell that stretches back thousands of years up and down the coast, and that continues to this day. One of the moving parts of my book research was going to see the traditional ceremonial dances of the North Coast tribes up in Eureka, where I learned that abalone is valued not only for its glimmer, but also for its spirit and song, the powerful sound that the shells make when they clack together when the regalia is danced to life. So the relationship between people and abalone entered a new phase with the arrival of the Spanish on the West Coast, first with galleons, and then with missionaries and more mercantilists in the 1700s, a period of history that we're still reckoning with when indigenous people were subjected to the brutal disruption of their subsistence culture and lives, while newcomers with different cultural views took over their ancestral lands. The Spanish soon put abalone to their own use when mariners realized they could pick up brilliant shells near Monterey and then sail north to trade with native peoples far up the coast for sea otter pelts. By the turn of the 19th century, the fur trade moved south to California, decimating sea otters and unwittingly starting to unravel underwater food webs. With their top predator plucked out, abalone that had previously lived in protected crevices reproduced without check, spread out into more exposed areas, and became super abundant throughout the nearshore marine environment. Monterey became famous for its shells, which British and American mariners called Monterey shells and California shells. But the name that finally stuck, abalone, was derived from the indigenous word of the local Ohlone people, Oloon, which you can see here as a place name on a historic Monterey map. And so I like to think that the word abalone continues to carry this deep indigenous heritage. The scientific name for California's abalone, Haliotis, also came into use around this time as European scientists started to identify American animals. The genus name Haliotis means sea ear. It was first named by Aristotle because the abalone where he lived in the Mediterranean were the size and shape of human ears, just actually like my little shell here. This illustration from an early 19th century British zoological journal is the first I found for a California abalone species, the black abalone. So, whoops. I'll just maybe ask if people are watching to mute yourself so that everybody doesn't hear the background noises in your rooms. Thank you. So the most important thing to note about this pivotal time is that the new superabundance of abalone was fundamentally misinterpreted. The newcomers streaming into California regarded the plentiful abalone as the natural state of the coast. They didn't realize that they were seeing an ecosystem that had already been disrupted with the sea otters removed. With the earlier ecological history and traditional knowledge loss, it set us up to misunderstand the biology of this animal. So the next phase of human abalone history begins with the gold rush. Chinese immigrants sailed across the Pacific hoping to find gold, but some found a different treasure on the rocky shores near Monterey in the flourishing abundance of abalone. An abalone rush soon began with hundreds of Chinese gathering abalone from shallow waters. It turns out the Chinese had a long heritage of holding abalone in high esteem for beautiful inlay work, medicinal purposes, and food. And so a large export market soon developed. Fishermen removed meat from the shells, boiled it, salted it, and then dried it on the beach. The final product was a hard chunk the size of a fist that, according to one reporter, resembled a horse's hoof. The cured dried meat was savored by the Chinese for its rich umami flavor. They kind of shaved the dry abalone into soups and kanjis. And at the time, white Californians didn't regard abalone favorably as a food, owing to racial prejudice and because they didn't really know how to prepare it. So after the easiest to pick abalone were fished out in the Monterey area, the rush spread south. By the 1870s, the Chinese had developed an extensive trade network with large junks picking up big sacks of dried abalone from fishing camps peppered down the coast to San Diego and beyond. Millions of abalone were removed. But ultimately, the Chinese abalone fishery was ended by broader racial hostilities when Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s. After the Chinese immigrants were excluded about a decade or so later, Japanese fishermen followed, this time using the new technology of hard hat dive suits, and they took abalone from deeper waters. And soon, as millions of abalone were removed for the export fishery, drying racks and large piles of shells became common sights up and down the coast. So it's important to note that through this period, there were tremendous racial hostilities. And so, in the absence of any other fishery conservation policies, local and state and federal laws that targeted immigrants for xenophobic reasons were really the only thing that intermittently restrained this abalone fishery. So, almost as soon as the abalone rush had begun, coastal communities and eventually the US Fish Commission raised alarm that too many were being taken. By the turn of the 20th century, that massive buildup of the intertidal and shallow dwelling abalone was in many places diminished from the abundance that people had known and believed to be natural. Newspaper headlines started to warn that California's abalone were headed for extermination. This was a time when Americans were first becoming concerned about conservation, having witnessed with the demise of otters, bison, passenger pigeons, that we could decimate and even eradicate species through market hunting. On the East Coast, salmon and shad runs had already plummeted too. In that context, there was an aspiration that California could do better with its fisheries by using scientific management. So the new State Fish and Game Commission set abalone size limits for the first time in 1901 and then directed biologist Charles Lincoln Edwards to study them in Southern California. Learning from Japanese divers, he became one of the first marine biologists to take the plunge in a hard hat dive suit. And he became very concerned to see so many abalone being taken. Edwards soon affirmed that the risk of extermination was real. He didn't think size limits were enough and recommended visionary conservation strategies, including the setting aside of special abalone reservations to protect some brood stock. His biologically based ideas were never acted on, but the xenophobic state legislature took a different tack to close down the Japanese fishery by wholly prohibiting abalone exports in 1913. So, albeit racially motivated, that policy gave the slow growing abalone a reprieve. Meanwhile, a new kind of interest in abalone had started to grow. With the arrival of the railroad in Los Angeles in the 1870s, affluent tourists started to come to California to appreciate the fresh air and beautiful scenery. And abalone soon became a star tourist attraction, with visitors hunting for beautiful shells, Here at the resort on Catalina Island, one popular activity was to take a glass bottom boat tour to view undersea marine gardens. Tourists could pay their boatman a quarter to dive down and retrieve an abalone shell, which soon became a quintessential California souvenir. Here's a souvenir stand run by a Chinese fisherman's family near Monterey. Increasingly, too, more residents and visitors who identified as sportsmen started to hunt abalone for recreation. You have to kind of crack up at these bathing suits. And so, as the shellfish started to become more scarce in the rocky nearshore areas, sportsmen blamed the commercial divers for taking too many, while commercial divers thought that the sportsmen were to blame for taking too many. This time, an invertebrate biologist drawn into the fray determined that red abalone put out millions of eggs every time they spawned. And presuming that the shellfish spawned every year, he theorized that it would be impossible to deplete them as long as the size limits were followed, because the animals would be able to spawn many times before being fished out. These findings affirmed the belief that abalone were inherently super productive and led California's Commercial Fisheries Agency to dismiss concerns about conservation. Unfortunately, no one understood yet the biology of this animal and how it was fundamentally connected to its ecological history and to the larger environment. So, in my book, I braided together different threads of abalone history, how abalone became a commodity through commercial fishing, an icon through recreation, and also the challenge of how early fishery scientists learned about deep dwelling abalone, how difficult it was. But I want to share a few stories too about how abalone entered other elements of California culture. So, in the early 20th century, the stature of abalone hunting and eating was boosted by this known set of poets and writers, including George Sterling, Mary Austin, and Jack London, known as the Carmel Bohemians. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, they left the city behind and headed to Carmel to live a simple, creative life, writing poems and books, growing their own food, and foraging for abalone became a central part of their scene. The shellfish wasn't just a source of free food, but also part of their vigor and inspiration. Sterling and London would dive for abalone and bring them back for beachside dinners. It turns out that an important part of preparing abalone's collagenous meat is that you have to pound it for an extended period. And to make the tedious job more fun, the Bohemians made up lines of rhyming verse to sing while pounding. It would have remained a playful private game amongst friends had not the writers been so famous. And I'd say this is an article from the New York Times, and this headline would definitely be clickbait today. In particular, Jack London wrote a novel with characters who traveled to Carmel, met up with the writers, and learned their ritual of pounding abalone and singing what would become known as the abalone song. And so here we are about halfway through my story, and I think we can use a little entertainment break. So I'm going to teach you a couple verses of this song, which captures the Bohemian spirit. And the words are on the screen, and we're not all together, but you can sing along at home if you'd like to the tune of Yankee Doodle. So here it goes. Oh, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony. But I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. We sit around and pound, but not with acrimony, because our object is a gob of sizzling abalone. And so you get the sense of the fun and silliness and playfulness of this. And hopefully that was as much fun for you as it was for me. You can see the Abalone song would go on to be published as sheet music as part of the World's Fair in 1939. Abalone also became famous through the promotional efforts of one of California's first celebrity chefs, Pop Ernest, who's pictured here. Pop developed a recipe for abalone fillets akin to the German Wiener Schnitzel. And when the state banned all export of abalone in 1913, he was well positioned to promote it as a premium seafood for California eaters, more specifically, white eaters who were still mostly unfamiliar with the shellfish, which you can see alluded to here in an ad for one of the restaurants. Uh, where he says that he is recognized as the discoverer of abalone as a white man's delicacy, reminding us once again of the prevalent ambiance of racial or racist thinking at the time. Eventually, Pop built a restaurant right on the Monterey Wharf, which drew tourists and celebrities, and he bought his abalone direct from Japanese fishermen, thereby helping to keep their fishery going strong. So, as domestic demand for abalone grew, commercial take continued to grow as well. And as the beds near Monterey wore thin, the industry moved south. Near Morro Bay, the Pierce brothers learned the trade of hard hat diving by watching Japanese divers and started to harvest fresh beds along the central coast. With new gas powered boats and air compressors, divers could routinely take 100 dozen abalone a day. And by the start of World War II, in just a decade, a small number of divers had fished out 10 million pounds, or about 250,000 animals. Meanwhile, in Southern California, the new sport of skin diving was started in the 1930s. Here are the Bottom Scratchers, the world's first official dive club. Its members would later recall they found abalone everywhere when they first started. And then skin diving and scuba diving became increasingly popular through the 1940s. And then after World War II, through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, abalone were taken, eaten, and enjoyed in communities up and down the coast, becoming a central part of California's 20th century beach and recreation culture. So, for an overview, you can see that annual landings from the commercial fishery, which was south of California, or south of San Francisco, excuse me, steadily climbed with a big break in the middle for World War II. I'll just mention two things here. That break in World War II was when Japanese fishermen were actually interned during the war, so that kind of shut down their fishery. Also, I'll mention that landings data was really the only way that the state of California monitored this and other fisheries. So when the fishery resumed after the war, with many returning veterans joining its ranks, the catch ramped up to a high peak of more than 5 million pounds taken in 1958. But soon thereafter, in the mid to late 60s, commercial abalone landings began to drop and then plummet without much advance warning. So, what happened? It wasn't one, but a number of things, hitting like big waves, one after another, piling on to finally erode that historic mass of built up broodstock, and ultimately to reduce populations of some species to alarmingly low levels. So, first in Central California, sea otters rebounded. It had been thought that these animals were wholly extirpated from California by the fur trade, but a small population was discovered near Big Sur in 1938. It slowly expanded southward, and by the late 1950s entered an area near San Simeon, considered to be the most productive abalone beds in the state. Just look at all that kelp. It soon became clear that sea otters love to eat abalone. It turns out that otters forage for abalone by breaking their shells with a rock. This set off a bitter and intractable conflict between commercial abalone fishermen who wanted the state to move the sea otters elsewhere and those rooting for sea otter recovery. As the fishermen saw it, the sea otters didn't follow size limits and were eating down what they considered to be the natural broodstock, their broodstock, since it supported their livelihoods. On the other hand, the otter supporters saw sea otters resuming their rightful place in the marine ecosystem. And this is a key pivot point in the story because up until this time, people believed that abalone were an inexhaustible seafood and that their prevalence was natural and owed to the animal's inherent superproductivity and fecundity. But the return of the sea otter pointed to a whole new understanding. In short, there would have been no abalone fishery at all had sea otters not been decimated earlier. And it finally became apparent that the abalone fishery had been based on a historic mass of built up stock, a windfall that was now being increasingly mined out by fishermen and now otters too. At the time, knowledge of kelp forest food webs with sea otters as a keystone species influencing the entire ecosystem was still just emerging, based in part on new ecological research in Alaska, where scientists studied islands with and without otters and found far richer kelp forests where otters were present. Many of you may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, the drawings on the right show the basics. On the top, the otter keeps kelp grazing urchins in check, allowing for the rich kelp ecosystem to flourish. And on the bottom, when urchins become dominant and graze down kelp, it simplifies the whole system. It was impossible to apply this new science from Alaska to far more complex ecosystems with more organisms in California, especially in the midst of such a contentious conflict. But it was the start of a paradigm shift where we began to see the wild animals that we use as foods, not only as a crop to be harvested every year, but also as parts of more complex ecological communities. There was a lot more going on underwater than we knew. And I want to underscore that this was a situation where the way that everyone, from fishermen, fishery managers, community members, and scientists, had been perceiving marine ecosystems, their lived experience and memories, was literally challenged, dissolved, and had to be reconstituted. It was a case where people could see things one way and then another, not unlike iridescence. But most important, inheriting the wrong story or just part of the story about abalone had caused us not only to misperceive the biology and ecology of the animal, it set us up to be poorly positioned when additional stressors started to hit. As sea otters expanded their range southward, fishermen were compelled to abandon their prized Central Coast abalone beds. And ultimately, sea otters became a protected species. And though red abalone persisted in the protected cracks and crevices, there was no longer a surplus for commercial fishing. At that point, California's commercial abalone divers moved south again. And with bigger and still more powerful boats, they focused their work on reefs not only off the mainland, but also around the Channel Islands. And recreational take in these areas with more and more party boats and divers would increase too. But despite the newly emerging understanding of abalone's history, there was no commensurate adjustment in how the fishery was managed. By the 1970s, state biologists determined that overfishing had already significantly reduced abalone broodstock in many areas of Southern California, and that the animals couldn't keep up. They tried to ratchet back commercial fishing pressure, but the politics proved impossible, in part because people believed that sea otters would just continue to expand their range. Meanwhile, another thing happened in Southern California. El Niños, a big one in 1958, and then an even more massive one in 1983. I found it really interesting to realize that until the 1980s, everyone had considered the warm water in big storms to be aberrations and flukes. No one yet realized that El Niños were sporadic but regular oceanic fluctuations tied to larger oceanographic cycles. Strong El Niños affected abalone in several ways. They devastate the kelp that abalone eat, reducing the abalone's ability to grow and also their ability to reproduce. So, up until this time, it had been generally presumed that abalone reproduced every year. But scientists who studied what happened before and after the 1983 El Nino discovered this was not the case. But that wasn't realized until many years later. So fishing continued on stocks that were not regularly reproducing and replenishing themselves. So it turns out that these early strong El Ninos were like postcards from the future, already starting to show us the insidious ways that extended periods of elevated seawater temperature could deeply affect marine life. And in the wake of the 1983 El Nino, another problem hit. This is a before photo taken out on Santa Rosa Island, one of the Channel Islands, in the early 1980s, where black abalone, the one intertidal species, still thrived and was abundant. Biologists surveying marine life in the intertidal zone, though, in the newly designated Channel Islands National Park, soon found black abalone that normally clamped hard to the rocks during low tide were hanging limp and loose and then dropping off helpless. The biologists soon realized that they were witnessing an epidemic. Over the course of just a few short years, 99% of black abalone on the Channel Islands withered up and died. Then the mysterious pathogen made it to the mainland and spread up and down the coast too. It was alarming for the biologists to see so many animals die in such a short time. They called it withering syndrome, and ultimately pathologists would determine it was caused by a bacterium related to rickettsia that became particularly active in warm water, and that it could afflict other species of abalone as well, albeit to a lesser degree. And if that weren't enough, the biologists soon realized that no one had even seen a white abalone in a long time. When they failed to find them with regular dive surveys, they searched deeper waters with a small submarine. Here's one of the biologists climbing into the Delta sub. Over the course of several days, Park Service and California Fish and Game researchers surveyed 77,000 square meters of reef and found only 4 white abalone in places where they had previously been abundant. Here's a view from their sub, looking at a lone white abalone on a rock. So, reviewing the fishery data and historic surveys, the biologists hypothesized that the once abundant animals had been unwittingly fished out, leaving too few animals too far apart to reproduce. It's called the Elie effect. When animal populations are reduced to extremely low levels, they have trouble reproducing because mates can't find each other. And in the case of the abalone, it's the animal's gametes broadcast out into seawater that can't find each other if they're too far apart. So this realization made the abalone biologists realize that it was critically important to monitor not just the numbers or sizes of abalone, but the density of abalone too. So as biologists pieced together the dire straits of the black and white abalone in Southern California in the early 1990s, these animals, along with pink, green, and red abalone, were still being fished commercially and were increasingly vulnerable to poaching too. So at that point, the state biologists came to the painful realization that California could no longer manage abalone for fisheries. It had to manage them to survive. So this is another crucial pivot point in the story. And on my book, I go into much greater detail and tell quite an amazing story of how recreational divers from Northern California, from throughout the state, came together in 1997 in a contentious, high stakes political campaign to press the state to finally close the commercial fishery and also their own sport fishery from San Francisco south. Ultimately, white abalone would become the first marine invertebrate to be listed as an endangered species in 2001, and the black abalone would be listed as well in 2009. In retrospect, I think it's important to observe that it was not easy for fishery managers to foresee when animals would reach a critical tipping point from being wholly available to the fishery to becoming imperiled. Even in the face of warning signs, it was hard to ratchet back California's abalone fisheries because fishers vigorously argued that there were more animals to fish, even as the populations and distribution of abalone shrunk, and even as cumulative environmental threats piled on. So, this underscores, I think, the importance of taking a precautionary approach to managing all the animals that we still use as wild foods. And ideally, of having an agreed upon management plan in place ahead of time so everyone can be on the same page when the chips are down. I think it also points to the need from people from more diverse perspectives and backgrounds, not only fishers, to become engaged in public processes and to advocate for sustainable fisheries and conservation. So, I want to shift gears now to tell you what's been happening to some of these animals more recently. So, with the endangered white abalone, which is a species of Southern California, the animals were so few and so far apart that biologists knew there would be no way they could ever reproduce. So, back in the late 90s, they decided to bring in some of the few remaining animals from the wild to start a captive breeding program. In my book, I recount this effort with all its monumental challenges and amazing discoveries about the animals. But the bottom line is that it's much harder to recover an endangered species than it would have been to conserve it in the first place. But after some heartbreaking setbacks in the past several years, there have been some exciting milestones of success. Scientists finally figured out how to breed large numbers of healthy juveniles. And this is now happening up at the Bodega Marine Lab in the cold, clean waters of Northern California. And here you can see one of those animals up close. Whoever thought a baby abalone would look so cute? And NOAA Fisheries, which has purview over recovery of endangered marine species through the Endangered Species Act, has funded and pulled together many partnering organizations to scale up the recovery effort. And in the fall of 2019, the captive raised white abalone were finally outplanted in Southern California for the first time. Putting these baby abalone out into an ocean full of predators is part of the challenge of recovery. And so different methods are being tested to see what will work best to protect the animals until they can become established and start. Remarkably, too, some additional white abalone have been discovered, wild ones, which is helping scientists to better understand the animals and provide some additional genetic diversity. So this is a continuing project that's been going on since 2019. And the ultimate goal is to get lots of white abalone pulse planted out into the ocean where they can reproduce on their own and help rebuild a viable population. And hopefully, all that's being learned in recovering these most endangered abalone can be applied, if need be, to other species and other marine animals in the future. So, with the endangered black abalone, the intertidal species most heavily afflicted by withering syndrome, the approach has been different. It's always it was always hoped that there might be some pockets of disease-resistant animals. And it turns out that in a very few places in the Channel Islands, black abalone have persisted and may now be starting to show some signs of rebound. And they've also persisted in Central California and kind of in the Point Reyes area too, where the water is cold. So when I first started my book back in 2010, I joined the National Park Service biologists in their monitoring work, which included surveys for those remaining pockets of endangered black abalone. At that time, we found only a very few, including some that were very sick. But an unexpected and hopeful thing happened. In 2013, scientists studying withering syndrome discovered something different when they were assaying tissues. It turned out to be a virus, a bacteriophage that breaks down the disease bacterium. And additional research that has confirmed that abalone that are afflicted by withering syndrome can endure the infection better and with far fewer symptoms if the virus is present too. So, in recent years, researchers have determined that this bacteriophage virus has spread through most California waters where withering syndrome bacterium is present and may now be helping to make it possible for black abalone and perhaps other species to recover. And so, believe it or not, a virus may well be a hero in this abalone story. Excuse me. I have to say, I found it to be totally fascinating to think about um, this whole ecology of viruses and bacteria that's happening in the natural world. That we don't see in our so many of us. I mean, we know very little about it. Meanwhile, the pink and green abalone of Southern California never became endangered, but became severely depleted. And after 25 years of fishing closure now, they may be slowly starting to rebound in some spots. On the mainland and still empty nearshore reefs of Orange County, efforts to kickstart green abalone recovery have been spearheaded by marine biologist, educator, and NGO volunteer coordinator Nancy Caruso, who's pictured here. Planning closely with state biologists, Nancy has collected wild broodstock from Catalina Island and is now raising green abalone at local aquaria for outplanting, aiming to rebuild a local nearshore population. So, Nancy and her team of volunteer divers who do surveys, monitoring, and watchdogging of restored abalone exemplify what it means for people to develop a new kind of relationship with abalone, built on an ethic of getting to know and care about local places and getting inspired to restore and steward their marine life. And so finally, now we return to the red abalone of Northern California, your abalone. So, since the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge in 1938, when recreational shore picking of abalone and then free diving, breath hold free diving became important for tourism, North Coast communities fought hard to keep commercial abalone fishing and scuba diving out of Northern California so they would conserve their prized shellfish. I found it to be very interesting that Northern California was so protective of its abalone. And as a result of that, a tightly managed freediving only sport abalone fishery had continued to thrive based on that historic buildup of abalone broodstock that remained, that was continually being replenished by red abalone parents in deeper water than could be reached by divers holding their breath. So there was like a deep water refuge of abalone parents, that were continually providing for abalone in Northern California. Thousands of divers and shore pickers were coming each year and from all over the state to hunt for abalone in kelp-rich coves and then repair to campgrounds and fry up abalone in a tradition that in some families spanned generations. But then a perfect storm of environmental stressors hit. In 2011, there was a harmful algal bloom that killed off hundreds of abalone off the Sonoma coast. In 2013, a wasting disease swept up the whole coast, decimating sea stars, including these sunflower stars, now considered to be mostly extirpated in most areas. Sea stars, it turns out, are important predators of purple urchins, and so without them, aggressive kelp eating urchins grew without check. Then in 2014, a marine heat wave hit called the blob from the north and El Nino from the south, making it harder for kelp, which need cold nutrient rich water to grow. Between the ravenous urchins and warm water, Northern California's kelp forest were reduced by more than 90% in just a few years, leading to the starvation of thousands of red abalone. And in 2017, the California Fish and Game Commission was compelled to close the North Coast's popular abalone sport fishery for the first time ever. The massive scale and speed of this undersea transformation has been sobering and heartbreaking, and is another blaring alarm bell about the perils of our climate crisis. Unfortunately, on the outermost Channel Islands in Southern California, which share similar oceanographic conditions and ecological communities as Northern California, we now have a similar situation. Without sea star predators, some of the richest kelp forests on the West Coast are now also being reduced to urchin barrens, with profound consequences for abalone and all of marine life. And so I see abalone through their plight in all this as sentinel animals, calling us to recognize their increasing vulnerability and the vulnerability of all marine life in the face of our climate crisis. Many people are now looking at different ways to address this suite of problems coastwide. In Northern California, there are efforts to create urchin-free oases with sport and commercial divers and volunteers removing purple urchins in strategic coves to help maintain pockets of bull kelp and red abalone. Some scientists are now working to bring back the sunflower sea star through a captive breeding program, and I've heard that there have been some individuals that have been discovered that may have resistance, and so some people are also looking for those individuals. In Southern California, there have long been efforts to restore patches of degraded mainland kelp forests, and so there are lessons to draw from there too. But perhaps the most important is that while all these actions can help to conserve biodiversity, ocean conditions remain an overarching driver for canopy kelps. Meanwhile, we've also come to learn and realize that these great undersea forests are incredibly important for sequestering carbon and thereby helping to stabilize the larger climate conditions too. So kelp is key, everything is connected, and there is a lot at stake. And so, as citizens of the West Coast and of the planet Earth, we find ourselves at another pivotal moment, which underscores to me why history is so important. The stories that we tell ourselves about how we got to now are literally the stepping off point for the future. Through the history I've shared, I hope you've gained an appreciation for some of the profound and enduring cultural values of abalone. We've seen how earlier generations derived tremendous economic benefit and enjoyment from abalone. But now these animals need for us to give something back. Hopefully, the perspective of history, what we've gotten wrong and right in the past, and all that we've learned can inspire and help us in this project. We need more people to learn and care about marine environments, to fall in love with the rich beauty of these places, their plants and animals, and to get involved in supporting community science efforts. We need more people to advocate for abalone recovery, for endangered species, for marine ecosystems, and for addressing the climate crisis. There are no easy answers, but we will need to come together if we want to find ways to rebuild resilience in our marine ecosystems, if we want marine life and abalone to endure with us into the future. So, as I worked on my book, a telling detail I discovered early on stuck with me as I worked, that many different cultures from all around the Pacific have associated abalone with vision. And so it's my hope that sharing this story of abalone can help us all to see a better path forward for these cherished kindred creatures and for all the life of our sea and earth. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you, Anne. That was terrific. It was really great. And the photography and all of that you had in the presentation is really remarkable. Great history. So thank you for being with us. And
you're welcome. And I just wanted to say, yeah, if anybody wants to learn more, definitely check out the book. And I don't know if we have time for questions or if you had any questions that came into the chat or.
well, I've lots of excellent and lots of thank yous, and I think if you'd like, if anyone has any questions, just to unmute yourself and feel free to ask directly. There was one question someone asked, Sarah asked, what do you think of commercial farming? I think.
What do I think of commercial farming? I think it has to be done very carefully, and it's a wonderful way that we can have the opportunity to eat abalone, and it has to be done very carefully. One of my favorite abalone farms in California is a place on the Monterey Wharf where somebody has um, basically created a farm where they're suspending cages from the Monterey, like it's like a big pier. And so it's out in the ocean. It's a relatively small scale. And that's a cool operation. Basically, the benefit of it is it gives us an opportunity to eat abalone, which is fabulous. And if you read my book, you'll see there's actually been a lot of knowledge that was gained through commercially abalone culture that has become absolutely crucial for recovery efforts. So there's that very important part of things too. And but another part of it is that there are risks involved with disease, and that's something that we have to be very careful about. For some reason, like when um, commercial abalone farms were happening, like in the 80s and such, there was people would be bringing animals from different places in the world in and breeding them together, and that resulted in the introduction of some diseases and parasites out into the natural environment as well. So whenever we do that, we just have to be very careful, I would say. But I think there's an opportunity to do it at an appropriate scale. And another thing I'll just mention along those lines, there is a lot more farming of, let's say, abalone, like in China, and on an industrial scale out in the ocean. And the thing that's interesting about that is when we have environmental issues such as heat waves and lack of kelp and stuff, those animals are afflicted in that situation too. So anyway, we have to think about sustainability too, I would say, with it. So hopefully that answers it.
Thank you for the great talk tonight. I'm originally from the Midwest, so abalone has been even more romanticized, I think, when you're especially not from California and you grew up with family and friends and people visiting the area, and you see shiny things and go, ooh, abalone. And then you visit California and you see it kind of displayed everywhere at like people's houses and bars and restaurants, and you go, it's so plentiful. And then of course you learn more about it. So anyway, I digress. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I do have a question though. I have a lot of questions, as I mentioned in the chat, but I'll read the book. It is very disturbing that the xenophobic, world of the United States is one of the reasons why there was a possible opportunity for, the abalone to be regenerated and to be not all maybe abalone to be endangered. I mean, how do we reconcile with that? I mean, I know we don't have the answer maybe 100%, but, what do you think of that as somebody who's been so in deep with abalone for so many years academically and intellectually, and then thinking about how, America basically said, no, you have to stop hunting this because you are an Asian person, and, oh, but us white guys can go out and do it all the time we want to when we want to. And then where do we see the almost potential genocide of both the culture domestically as humans and domestically as a creature in the environment? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll just say at that time, actually, white people weren't hunting the abalone. It was really just the Chinese and then the Japanese. And I think the thing that I see about it is that that racism at that time was just very prevalent. It was actually how, and it, it persists. But when you go back and you study history, you realize that that those are categories that, I mean, we have come a long way in questioning and thinking about things differently. But at that time, people literally were that's how the categories of how people thought of the world, the categories of how people thought about fisheries. And so it's quite amazing when you go back and read the things that were said, and it makes me feel like, we still have a long way to go, but we have come a long way. And I didn't really get into talking about it further, maybe as much as I could have, and I didn't even in the book talk about it as much as I would have liked to, just because of space constraints. But I think the most important group to be associated with abalone is Indigenous people, and they had a relationship with this animal for over 10,000 years. And through this period of history, when I was trying to understand how were they engaged, how were they involved, um, they were not at the table. They were put into the category of recreational sport divers in the fishery, and so they participated as sport divers. But now, in 2015, I think California finally had a policy that started to recognize Indigenous perspectives and invite tribes to engage. And I think everybody's come to realize, well, you're not sports fishing is not the nature of your relationship. You have a different kind of relationship to the place and the animal. I mean, that's how they feel, and that was not appropriate. And so I think it's interesting that we're now having um, that perspective in fish and wildlife management. Unfortunately, now, I mean, it's just tragic. We don't have the abalone. We're now in a position of trying to figure out how are we going to get them back. But anyway, that's, I think, the thing I think about with that. And I do want to say, maybe now that we're just chatting, if you don't mind hanging out with me a little more, one of the things that's happening now in Northern California, just so you guys know, especially if some of you are docents, is that we have a situation where abalone have come in close to shore because there's no kelp out anywhere. And so you may find yourself in a position of seeing them close to shore, and there may even look like there's a fair number of them. When I was there, I really wanted to take time and go wander around and look myself. I didn't have time because I had to go and it was foggy and everything. But that's what I've heard, that they're there. It's not because they're abundant. It's because they've come in from the depths and there is no food for them. And so those animals now are particularly vulnerable. And, we can't have them being taken in because they are literally the brood stock that's going to have to be the animals that will enable future populations to get started. So I think that's a really important thing I wanted to share with you all.
I don't even know where to start, to be honest, Anne, because, I mean, first of all, like, just such an amazing presentation. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but I just want to say, so I grew up in Fort Bragg. I was one of the abalone divers. You can actually see my first three abalone behind me, kind of in this washed out room. And now I work for NOAA Fisheries. I study salmon up in Washington. And so sort of getting to my question is, with salmon, there's a really fascinating history there too. And there are a lot of parallels, right? Native American tribes completely depended on different species of salmon and have been excluded traditionally and historically. And we've done a hell of a job decimating amazing runs of salmon, just as we have with abalone. And it's kind of death by a thousand cuts too. So it's all these different things, and people pointing fingers. It's the sea lions, or it's the birds, or it's the tribal fisheries, and everybody wants to point at everybody else. Yeah. And you ended with such optimism, and I can't help but feel super pessimistic about it because, we talk about abalone farms, or I mean salmon farms. We have Atlantic salmon over in the Pacific here that escape and bring disease and all these things, and it continues to feel like, as humans, we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to save something, but we want to, we just want the best of both worlds all the time. And so I really appreciate how you ended with, like, we need to come together. And you said there's no easy answers, so there might not be an answer here at all. But I just want to figure out, how do we drop all of our disagreements and differences and actually, like, come together and have a conversation about what we need to do. I mean, do you have any insights on that?
Well, that I totally agree. And I hear you, Dylan, and I struggled with that sort of thing in my story. And I'll just tell you, I live in Oregon, and I actually helped to edit a book, Jim Likatoch's book called Salmon Without Rivers. So I have a close knowledge of salmon history too. And so I really thought a lot about those parallels quite a lot. And I was hoping that by telling the story of history, that could help give us some perspective, because one of the problems is a lack of shared understanding that comes up. That's part of the finger pointing, oh, it's this one or it's that one who's doing it, or, well, they're trying to take away our rights to fish, or, those kinds of things that prevent us from getting to the meaningful fishery management solutions. At least the environmental stressors is a kind of another larger issue. But anyway, I was hoping that, telling the story, even looking at it in a historical perspective, it almost could possibly deflect some of the current conflicts that we have persisting, because you could see that we've inherited them. And so I was kind of hoping that might be helpful. But also, as I was mentioning, this idea of getting other perspectives at the table. I mean, I think when Indigenous people show up and we have that realization, or to, like, obviously you have had, and maybe Sarah has had, and I have had, of, oh my gosh, we have wrecked everything. Can we have some humility here and start figuring it out? I mean, I think that having those larger perspectives might help. That's my hope. But I also feel like, as a communicator and a conservationist myself, we have to find ways to be hopeful. And with salmon, it's about working on habitat. It's keeping the seed for the future, right? Keeping the brood stock, keeping places or oases where we can protect biodiversity and where evolution can happen. I mean, we're going to need to have animals that can evolve in these situations. And I go back to that slide I showed you guys early on of abalone have been around for 60 million years on the West Coast, right? So as long as we can give them some space, they should be able to get through somehow this bottleneck, if we can make sure to support that. So I guess for me, yeah, it's like different perspectives in time, I would hope would be helpful in thinking about that. But they are huge challenges. But we cannot despair only and just go down into little holes of sadness. We have to just keep working. So anyway, there is no easy answer, but that's my answer, is just keep working and try to focus on the inspiring things. And I mean, the things that, like, for example, those of you who are docents and trying to help people learn about the marine environment, maybe not everybody will get involved, but maybe 1 out of 100 people might be a young person who would go on to be a biologist, or somebody who would get engaged in a conservation group and go and testify at the Fish and Wildlife Commission and talk about how a different perspective about abalone or something like that. Anyway, some thoughts for
Thanks
you.
so much.
And thanks for sharing your story about abalone. One of the things that was, and I think this, you guys, I will just mention this in the Fort Bragg community, your place. I know some of you are newcomers, but there's such a rich history of abalone in your communities. And one of the things I really enjoyed was hearing those stories from people. I remember a woman who grew up in Casper and grew up on a ranch there telling me, going out and finding abalone as a little girl. It was literally like communion to her. That was the image or the word metaphor she used. But so many people having such personal stories and experiences that were um, just so deeply meaningful. And so we have the loss of an animal, but also that human connection. And it could be really interesting, I think, for as a historian, I think about collecting these stories, and that might be also a way to interpret or help people to understand the marine environment. So that might be a fun project if people have collecting abalone stories could be a fun project. So anyway,
Mhm.
yeah, well, thanks so much, you guys, and yeah, read the book and all the best with your projects at the Noyo Center. And I'll look forward to the next time I come down and see what down that far down the coast to see what you guys are up to.
Good. Well, we look forward to it. And thanks again. We really appreciate your being with us.